to be. And if any of you are not singing this in your heads, as I say, the talk today is called If You Go Down to the Woods Today. And I will say that there are no teddy bears involved in this production. No teddy bears will be harmed in the making of this presentation. I don't think I'm going to be mentioning picnics as such, but hopefully definitely some surprises. And if you do want to go down to the woods in disguise, that is entirely up to you. I will not judge. So what I thought I would do is, as I was saying to sort of Claire before we came online, is the subject of, well, I've called it here the Royal Forest of Waltham, which is technically what it is, but Epping Forest is what is probably more known as colloquially. It's a huge, huge subject, massive. I mean, I limited the book I wrote on it recently to around 50,000 words. But if I showed you the sort of the size of some of the books I read as reference just on small points for my book, they're huge. So it is a massive subject. So I'm really only going to be touching on bits of it, but hopefully it will give you enough of an interest to want to go and look at it a bit more. What I thought I would go through in brief is what the history of a royal forest is, and why woods and forest are two completely separate things, or they were historically. Also, some of the interesting stories that have abounded in Epping Forest, to use its most commonly known name, and also some of the sort of more, shall we say, ghosty events that have happened there. And also, just for you guys, there is an exclusive that I wrote about, a story that I'm going to talk about in the book. Since writing the book, I have found out what they believe the answer to this story was, and I have not told a soul. So you guys are getting a Penny Griffiths-Morgan exclusive in this presentation. How lucky do you feel right now? If you're still awake, I'm very impressed. I live probably 20 miles away from Epping Forest. I have driven through it on many an occasion. And I knew about some of its myths, some of the legends that of all the bodies that were buried there, of it being a haunt of the omnipresent highwayman Dick Turpin. In fact, there's a story that if all the bodies that were buried in Epping Forest were to stand up, there'd be more of them than trees, all those kind of things. But I didn't know much more about it than that. And it was all Jane Harris's fault. Jane Harris of Help My House is Haunted. She contacted me. It was during the COVID pandemic, and she contacted me. She said, we're desperate for a historian to work on this episode of Help. And I'd never done anything really like that. I've done TV stuff, obviously I've done online stuff like this. But I'd never done anything like that. And she said, we need you to do the history research for the show, for this episode that's going to be based in Chingford, which is part of Epping Forest. And I decided to do, I like to do lots of research. I like to have all the answers. I hate not knowing something if someone asks me a question. And if I don't know it, you can guarantee I'll go off and look it up. And so I started doing the research based on the information they gave me, the location, roughly what they thought the haunting was to do with. And I was coming out with story after story after story that had never been really publicized or talked about. And I turned up at the filming, and there's a reason I'm telling you all this. I turned up at the filming with a stack of research, probably about 2 inches thick. And we probably used 1% of it for the episode. It was the Frankie Essex episode, if anyone's wondering. And it was actually on the end of that when Jane was sort of leafing through my research after we'd finished filming, and she said, there's a book in this. You need to put all of this into a book. So if you've read Elements and you like it, please feel free to thank Jane, which is why she did the forward. If you've read Elements and you've thought, what a load of boring dross, you can also blame Jane for it, because she was the one that suggested I took all my research and put it into a book. And I must admit, I really enjoyed writing it, not least because it was one I didn't have to travel too far to do the research. Some of the things I've done, it's been a couple of hours drive each way. So this one was quite a nice one to do. But I uncovered quite a lot of things which I did not have a clue about, even though I've lived in Essex for 25 years, have driven through bits of the forest on many an occasion. I learned so much. So, obviously, some of you may have read the book. If you have, thank you ever so much. If you haven't, it's one of the ones that's available on Amazon. You just have to look up Penny Griffiths-Morgan and it should bring up all the books I've written. Currently, there's 5. Number 6 is due to be released imminently. So, forests. I think one of the biggest misconceptions about the word forest is that most people assume it to mean woods. They assume it to mean a large wooded area. And in modern day English, that is probably how the term is used. It's almost interchangeable with woods. But technically, forest law, as it's called, dates back to William the Conqueror. He actually introduced it as a kind of, I suppose you could say, a legal institution to ring fence areas where maybe the hunting was really good. So there was a lot of deer, there would have been boar, there would have been wolves, all those kind of animals. And he made it a legal thing that these areas, if an area was forested, it was therefore owned by the crown. It wasn't part of common law. So that meant you couldn't treat it as common land. You weren't allowed to go, hunting for hare to feed your family. You weren't allowed to go lopping wood down to build a house or even a fire. And there were very, very strict penalties involved for those people who did. Now, the king could give permission to other nobility to go hunting in his forest, but so they would charge them to do so. So it was also a money-making exercise. Now, the naturalist Oliver Rackham back in the 19th century tried to work out just how much the county of Essex, and there's a map here that's from early 14th century, 1301, as you can see there. It was trying to work out just how much of Essex was actually forested prior to the 14th century. And he believes it was probably around 20% of the county was forested back in 1086. Which is a huge amount, and people were having to live there because they'd lived there prior to William the Conqueror coming over, so he didn't boot them off. He just made it incredibly strict. I mean, you've probably heard of the Forest of Dean, the New Forest, Sherwood Forest. These were all royal forests that were forested, i.e. enclosed and made the property of the king as opposed to common land. It was not a popular decision, as you can imagine. For example, you weren't allowed, if you lived in these areas, you weren't allowed to keep hunting dogs. The one dog you were allowed to keep, and this still makes my skin crawl when I read about it, were mastiffs. I like mastiffs. I like big dogs. The mastiffs had to be declawed. That was the only way you were allowed to keep one as a guard dog. But if it had been declawed, so it couldn't harm the king's animals, the king's, I suppose, hunting harem or whatever you want to call it. So there were very, very strict rules if this wasn't the case. Another thing would be that the fields, the land that these common people had farmed for years and years, suddenly became part of the forest. So therefore, they weren't common land anymore. And a lot of them, they weren't allowed to use the soil in these incredibly rich areas to grow crops, to therefore feed their families. It was an incredibly, incredibly unpopular ruling. Now, this map also shows the disafforestations. I need to get my tongue and teeth in for that one. Disafforestations that commenced late sort of 1200s, sort of following the Magna Carta and all those kind of things. But not everywhere was disafforested. Now, disafforested does not mean chopping down the woods or the trees that were in there. It means removing that boundary, removing that legal enclosure, if you liked, that stopped people using it. But as I said, it was not a popular decision. I mean, the country didn't like the fact that this French king had come in and started telling everyone what to do. This made it even more unpopular. It was very much the Britons against the Normans for a very long time. In fact, even so, there was a rhyme published in the Peterborough Chronicle in 1086. It was the rhyme of King William. I'll read it out for those of you who can't maybe see the screen properly. But he established many deer preserves, and he set up many laws concerning them, such that whoever killed a hart or a hind should be blinded. Yeah, if you were caught killing one of the animals on the Crown's property, you could be blinded. If that wasn't, I mean, it's interesting to know that his William the Conqueror's nickname was William the Bastard. And not because of this sort of stuff, it was because the fact he was actually believed to be illegitimate. But hey, if the cap fits, I don't know. It was actually one of his sons who was even worse. Henry I not only had people's eyes gouged out, and there is an argument that William actually wasn't the one to do this. He threatened to do it, but he never did. But Henry I, there are accounts, he had people's eyes gouged out for hunting in his forest, or poaching as they would have called it. You could have your hands and feet chopped off if you were seen to be taking property from the Royal Forest, even if you lived there. And it was only when King Richard I, who was around from 1189 to 1199, came into power, that these kind of punishments stopped. Basically because he was incredibly religious, and he felt that the desecration of a man who is deemed to have been created in the image of God over wild beasts. So in other words, a man who had killed a wild beast could lose his eyes, his hands, his feet, which you can imagine back in the 11th and 12th century there's no disability allowances or anything back then. They would have died in a lot of cases, starved. He believed that treating a beast as more important than man who was created in the image of God, therefore perfect, was amoral and sacrilegious. So he stopped these kind of penalties being incurred and changed it to a system of basically fines, imprisonment, or banishment. You could be banished from the area if you were seen to be committing it on a regular basis. As I said, disafforestation started to begin about 50 years after that, and the rules started to get a bit more lenient, although there were still rules regarding the actual woods, the actual wooded areas within these forests. And they had things like what they called lopping rules, so that one time of the year you were allowed to go around. If you lived on the land, you were allowed to go around and sort of picking up the wood and chopping dead wood off the trees. It was kind of an early tree surgeon, suppose, sort of maintenance thing, but it was very, very strictly controlled, so that the main trees which were used by the Crown, and if you read my book, I did find accounts of wood from Epping Forest being used for the Royal Navy under Charles II. In fact, there was a letter from Samuel Pepys talking about Epping Forest and the quality of the wood in Epping Forest, which for a nerdy historian like me was quite exciting to be holding a letter written by Samuel Pepys. But so there was still a lot of rules, although the hunting and stuff was still allowed. The rules, though, as to what you could take from the forest, they were still quite interesting. For example, if a river ran through the forest, you couldn't fish in it. However, if you caught the fish before they hit the forest river, you were allowed to take them, because at that point they weren't part of the king's property. You were allowed to catch the bees that maybe flew into the forest to create your own hive, but you weren't allowed to take the honey that the bees had created in an established hive, because that was part of the forest. There was an awful lot of rules. And like I say, the book I've got that talks about all the different rules is about 2 inches thick. So if you want to learn more about them, I could recommend a few books to read, but they were intensive rules. It's not really surprising. So with that kind of pressure, the ghost stories started. Now, there are a plethora of ghost stories about the area known as Epping Forest, which was previously Waltham Forest and was the Royal Forest of Waltham before that. Interestingly, Waltham actually means wooded area, and they believe that dates all the way back to King Harold, the one who got the arrow in his eye fighting against Normans. And he actually had very, very strong links to the area. So one of the ghost stories that I got told about when I started researching the book was this one. It's the story of Knocker's Pond, which is on Lindsay Street in Epping. One sec, excuse me, sorry. It's on Lindsay Street in Epping. Now, the pond does still exist. It's not quite as big as it was, but it is still there. And the story I got told was that people see, well, there's lots of things that people supposedly see appearing out of this pond. And yes, I know there's a little white figure on there. This photo was sent to me by someone who had it sent to her 20 years ago, so it wasn't done with a digital camera. And she said when she first saw it, she didn't notice the little sort of white splodge on there. I did send it off to someone to analyze it, and he confirmed it's not digital, but he can't confirm what that splodge is. It could be just a splodge. It could be something that looks a bit more eerie. I don't know. I am not saying either way. I'm not making that decision, but I did see the sort of, and this isn't my expertise. The technical side is not my expertise, but a professional photographer did look at it, and he sort of said it could just be a trick of the light, but it was not it was an old style photo, if that makes sense, you know, a developed, not a digital photo. Anyway, one of the accounts is that ghostly figures on horseback are seen emerging out the pond in a full gallop. Sometimes these figures are described as Roman soldiers. Sometimes they're actually described as cavaliers, i.e. royalist soldiers from the Civil War. Now, both of those are plausible. Both of those are plausible because both of those groups did spend time, for want of a better term, in Epping. However, there are other stories. The local story was that a milkman was doing his rounds one day, an old-style milkman with a horse and cart and everything else, and he fell asleep. And his cart, for some reason, the horse took the cart straight into the water. Now, I would argue that because horses are not stupid, and they wouldn't sort of, even if the reins were telling them to go along, they ain't going to go into the water, but supposedly they did. And then he reappeared headless as the headless milkman. Like I say, it's an amusing story, but it's one that Epping people would tell their kids as a ghost story. However, I also found the newspaper articles that are on here, and that's talking about someone who, there was a young, and this is where a kind of a milkman thing comes in, because there was a young lad who was the milkman's assistant, and he found some belongings by the pond, and he alerted people to it. He alerted that there was someone's belongings folded up by the pond, and inside those belongings was a letter, which you can see part of it here. Dear brother, when you receive this, etc., etc. They dragged the pond, and this happened in March of 1878. They dragged the pond to see if they could find anyone, and they found no one still in the pond. And this man had basically disappeared. They also tried to find out, they sent a telegram, sorry, to the brother who this letter was addressed to, and didn't hear anything back from him. What I did was I did a bit of online research, and these men existed, this brother existed, and he did exist at the address that the letter was being sent to. So it makes me wonder, what happened? Were they one in the same person? Was he trying to disappear? I don't know. When I'm researching one of my books and I want to get local stories from an area, what I like to do is utilize good old social media. And so I went on the Epping page, and I spoke to the admin there, and I said, is it all right if I put an appeal out here for stories? And I got one back. And it was to do with, funnily enough, this actual pond. And I've got it in the book. I actually did recount it in the book, what this chap Scott told me. And in a nutshell, he said him and his mates, it was back in the 70s, him and his mates had been out in Harlow for the evening, which is a couple of miles away from Epping. And they were coming back at about 10 o'clock in the evening on their way back to their homes in Epping, and they were cutting across the fields. I can confirm you can do that from Harlow. I used to, my husband is from Harlow. I've been to Harlow on many an occasion. And back in the day, you could cut across fields to get to Epping from Harlow. They didn't want to go home, teenagers, they were enjoying themselves. And so they were walking past where Knockers Pond is on Lindsay Street. And they said it was suddenly really cold. It suddenly went uncharacteristically cold. And they heard a weird noise that sounded like horse hooves. And this is at night. You don't tend to get many people out riding their horses, even in the 70s at night. And when they looked up, they saw, and they said it had gone very foggy all of a sudden. And when they looked up, they saw illuminated in this car headlights an old style horse and buggy. Apparently it freaked them all out, so they all started running. They did actually tell people about their story, and they were actually featured in a local newspaper because they were the first to have, more than one of them, to have a visual sighting of this supposed headless horseman. But a horse and cart appeared out of the buggy, and they heard the noise, and then it just vanished as they ran away. Now, of course, I did ask them how drunk they were, and he said, well, we weren't that drunk. It was only 10 o'clock at night. We'd had a few, but we weren't stoned or anything like that. But they said they just remembered the fog coming in, how cold it was, and then suddenly to see this thing illuminated by these car headlights, and it scared them to the point they all ran home. Who knows? Maybe they did imagining it. Maybe they'd been told the ghost stories as kids. I don't know. But he said even sort of 50 years on, he still vividly remembers that happening to him. So, like I say, anyone ever writing books, go to a local page and ask people if they've got any stories, because although there'll be a few who sort of, no, it doesn't exist, you'll always get some goodies. Another thing that one of my sort of subjects that I love to learn about is aviation, is the wars, is the social side of it. But also, I say aviation, I love aeroplanes. My ideal sort of day out is to go to somewhere like Duxford Museum and just be left to wander around the aeroplanes. And yes, I even talk to them sometimes. I am that bad. But one of the areas in Epping Forest, or what is classed as Epping Forest, is somewhere called Lippets Hill. Some of you may have heard of it. Now, Lippets Hill is a very interesting place, and I'm going to explain what these different photos are all about, because up until very recently, it was where the Met Police for this side of London kept some of the helicopters. But originally, back in World War II, it started off life as an anti-aircraft gun emplacement, which is what the middle photo is showing. Shortly after it was an anti-aircraft, and this is still during World War II, it became a German prisoner of war camp, hence the other two pictures. And that statue there of the man with the incredibly perfect pectoral muscles was actually done by one of the German POWs. Now, from about the 1950s, the police force took it over and used it for various things. They did do firearms training there. And anyone who's interested in the royal family, Will and Harry went there to learn how to evade being kidnapped, believe it or not. But it's a massive site, and they still have some of these anti-aircraft gun emplacements in place. Obviously, they don't have the guns on them or anything, but you can walk around them. Well, I say you can walk around them. Legally, you probably couldn't just turn up, because it is quite heavily guarded, because apparently some of the huts do have very, very secret police stuff going on in them. But I thought, being me, I'd write to the Met Police, or NPAS, the National Police Air Service, and say, any chance I could come and have a look around? Didn't expect to get an email back saying, yes, when would you like to? And I got to go and look round. Obviously, I was chaperoned the whole time. I even got a chance to climb into one of the helicopters to see what they looked like inside. I was like a giggling child at that point. But I also got to look at all these things. And of course, I asked the very lovely police officer who was showing me around. She was one of the observers on the helicopters. Do you have any ghosts here? Yes, was the answer. Quite a few people have seen and heard a German walking around. And I said, well, that's interesting. And she goes, why is that? I said, well, did you know this was a German prisoner of war camp in World War II? She did not know that. In fact, quite a few of them didn't know that. And I said, can't you see this, the huts, how they look? Do you not, and never thought about it. But a couple of the colleagues have seen someone walking around speaking in German, and when they go to speak to him, he has disappeared. They've had things like the hangar doors have been opened when they shouldn't have been, and there was no one there, and there's no one on camera opening them, but they've opened. They've had the fuel bowsers locked open, i.e. not the safety switch to stop the fuel coming out has been locked open before, and they cannot explain it. I did offer to do an investigation there for them, but apparently the Met Police weren't too happy with me doing that, although I'm not giving up. I'll keep asking, because you never know what's the worst they can say. But this place is meant to be haunted by a German soldier who, when you think about the fact it was a German POW camp, is plausible. There's loads more stories about Lippitz Hill, which I talk about in the book, but it's just to show that there's places that even friends of mine who live in the area didn't know the history of the NPAS base that's just on their doorstep. And it's a very, very interesting one. Like I say, there's a lot of the subjects in this talk I could do a whole hour on their own, but I'm not going to. So I'm going to flick through other things and see if there's something that catches your attention. Right. There's another legend here. This is the King's Oak. It's still there. It was anyone here who ever watched the Towie series, especially in its early days. We're not all like that from Essex, I have to say. But they used to frequent this place quite a lot because it does have quite a nice restaurant. And it's bang in the middle of the Epping Forest, for want of a better term. And it's in an area called High Beach, which has had a lot of its own history. Now, this is where one of the legends came in that I wanted to see if there was any truth in it, because in front of the King's Oak used to be a very, very, well, it's almost like a burnt out tree stump. And it was an old oak tree, probably no more than 2 foot high. It literally was sort of falling apart at the seams. And the legend was that Henry VIII, good old Henry VIII, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, Henry, was sat there by that tree after a busy day's hunting, waiting to hear the guns go off to say that Anne Boleyn had been executed on the 19th of May in 1536. Now, it's a nice story, and they say that's why the pub's called the King's Oak, because Henry VIII sat outside it whilst waiting to hear the guns go off from the Tower of London, which is about 12, 15 miles away, to say that his second wife had been executed. I was a bit skeptical of this story just because of the distance, even though obviously you wouldn't have had the noise pollution you have now. There wouldn't have been all the buildings in between the Tower of London and Epping Forest, but it just seemed to me it didn't quite fit. So I spoke to a few historians, friends of mine, and one of them got in touch with Dr. Tracy Borman, who, for those of you who don't know, she is a Tudor expert. She's an amazing historian. She is one of the curators of the royal palaces. And she came back and said, no, that story is complete and utter rubbish. According to the royal diaries, he was actually at Whitehall, which used to be a huge palace back in the day before it burnt down, where most people have heard of Whitehall. Well, that was a massive palace. And he was actually based there waiting to hear the guns go off. And as soon as he heard that he was now free, and no longer married, shall we say, he got in a boat and went up the river towards his Chelsea manor house to see Jane Seymour, wife number 3. And he was betrothed to her the following day. So that's the kind of story I like to find out the answer, because there's still people who say, yes, it was where Henry VIII was. He was hunting in the forest. He did hunt in the forest. He hunted in Chelmsford because he owned a palace here as well. He owned the Bewley Palace, which is now the Newhall School in Chelmsford. So I know full well he hunted very near to where I live, but he was not hunting in Epping Forest on that day. What it's more likely is that that tree could actually date back to good old King Harold, the one who, arrow in the eye, Battle of Hastings Harold, because he had very, very strong links to Waltham, which is another one of the places, Waltham Abbey, right next to the forest, and was originally part of the forest. He bequeathed money to the abbey there. In fact, they even say his body was held there for a while whilst it was awaiting burial. The other more likely answer, which really does spoil people's fun, is that it's called the King's Oak after Charles II, because any pub you find called the King's Oak or anything to do with oak and king is far more likely to go back to the legend of Charles II, who is meant to have hidden in an oak tree to escape the dastardly Roundheads while he was trying to get out of England. But is it to do with Henry VIII, which is one of the common myths? I don't think so. I don't think so at all. Now, you ready for your exclusive? This is an exclusive, and if nobody, you're muted, so I can't hear if you laugh at my jokes. But please do show me you're laughing at my jokes. All right. This is Warren Hill Woods. It's another part of the bigger thing of Epping Forest, and it's kind of that cut through that you can see in the photo takes you through from Loughton to Chingford. It's a lovely walk, really lovely walk. But back in, as you can see in the article I've included there, back in 1908, people started complaining that they were being attacked using this cut through because it gets you from one train station to another. They were complaining they were having things thrown at them as they walked through the woods. In fact, a police officer who walked through when it was reported to try and see if there was some naughty little monkeys hanging up in the trees had his hat taken off his head by a flying missile. One woman said that something grabbed her by the hair, lifted her up, and then dropped her to the floor. Everyone thought it was a poltergeist. It must have been some kind of poltergeist haunting Warren Hill Woods. When I wrote the book, that was all the information I could find. I was researching to put this talk together for you all, and I found the culprit. Not so much twit, twit, twoo as twit, twit, who. It was owls. There were owls nesting in the trees who didn't like the humans coming that close to them and were attacking them. Now, I'm no ornithologist. In fact, I'm scared of birds, I'll be completely honest. So I don't know how plausible it is, but that was given as the reason that all these people got injured. This poor woman refused ever to walk through those woods again on her own because she got picked up by her hair. But yes, it was owls, which kind of just goes to show that debunking things, I suppose, is an important thing to think of all the possible potentials. So if you're ever in the woods and you think something's being thrown at you, maybe it's birds. Maybe it's birds. Might not be. Might be a poltergeist, but maybe it's birds. Now, I'm not to say, though, that there's not stuff in these woods that wants to communicate. I genuinely think there is. I have had some very, very unusual experiences. And these aren't proper bona fide investigations. I'm not saying it's scientific or anything like that. I'm a historian primarily, but I have had some weird interactions. So this track is a lovely long track. We decided to go there one Saturday, I think it was, or Sunday. It was a weekend day to walk the dog and walk the children as well. And my eldest son is very, very interested in the paranormal. He enjoys watching it, learning about it. And so he asked if we could take a few gadgets with us. Now, he knows that you shouldn't rely on these gadgets as being an indication that something is haunted. There's many, many reasons that gadgets go off. but it's still interesting. We had a K2 going from red to green on command and going off on command. We had a spirit box actually having a conversation with us. And when I was telling off my younger son for having a tantrum because he didn't want to walk anymore, we heard someone shout, "Stop," to us through the spirit box. And when he got really upset because he thought he'd angered the spirits of the forest, it apologized for upsetting him. I mean, these sort of things are strange. I can't explain. I can't tell you the reasons why. I'm sure there's someone with a scientific background who could, but there was a feeling there. But it's not a nasty feeling, and it's certainly not one that would throw missiles at your head. But yes, these strange adventures in Epping Forest, birds, owls to be exact. Another haunting that is many people have picked up on in the forest is that of soldiers, especially sort of early 20th century soldiers. So we're talking World War One era, maybe just before World War One. And whilst there were quite a few RAF bases in the vicinity, quite a few, there aren't really any army encampments. Essex is more, especially since the 1900s, is more well known for its RAF links than its army links. So why have mediums, various devices, and everything else picked up on war type language and soldiers specifically? Epping Forest was, if you like, the original health farm for East Londoners. When the trains were developed in the 1860s, 1870s, and actually before that, they'd come out on horse and carriages, or horse buses, as they were known. They would come out for the day to take the air, become healthier, and just enjoy, I suppose, a picnic. So maybe there were teddy bears in the forest back then, I don't know. But one of the things that started being built were these retreats, like this one that I've pictured called Riggs Retreat. There's only one of these retreats. There were lots of them. There's only one of them still standing. It's called Butler's Retreat, and that's in Chingford. But William Riggs, who was the son of the original Riggs, who set up Riggs Retreat, he actually fought in the Boer War. He had been a soldier. And when World War One broke out, he tried to enlist, but he was too old. And so they said, well, can you help us with catering instead? And so because Riggs here was on Wellington Hill, which is one of the highest parts of the forest, it was used as a training base for various battalions, the artists rifles, the bankers battalion, and a few others. But it was also used as a spot to counter the Zeppelins, which were flying over, the big airships, which is what they used the original air raids. It's a common misconception that air raids only happened in World War II. They didn't. They did actually start in World War One, but these Zeppelins were very slow, very cumbersome, and couldn't get as far as obviously bombers could 40 years later. But one of the words that I've heard repeated an awful lot when the investigators have gone in are things like fire. Now, I wondered if that was soldiers doing their training exercises, telling people to fire. It could be, but the other thing it could actually relate to is the fact that Riggs Retreat here burned down in September 1916. And an awful lot of soldiers were absolutely devastated because they'd seen that as their retreat, somewhere they could go to, relax, for want of a better term. And there are reports that even the message actually got to some of the soldiers who trained there, who were now on the Western Front and other areas, and they were writing back their condolences to the Riggs family that this place had burnt down in a fire. So it could be either, it could be nothing. But it's still an interesting thing that most people wouldn't think to look into. If they think they've heard a soldier shout fire in Epping Forest, are they going to think it's the place that they had a nice meal at that burnt down, that they would have spent time with their colleagues? And it's said that a lot of them held William Riggs in incredibly high regard because he just wanted to do his thing for king and country. One of my favourite buildings in Epping Forest, and you can go and visit this, and it is free access, is the Queen Elizabeth's Hunting Lodge. Now, this is actually bang next door to Butler's Retreat that I told you about earlier. And there's some very interesting stories about this place. I don't know if they're true. I haven't found yes or no where they started from, but I'm going to tell you them with that caveat that I don't know if these are true, but if they are, I quite like them. So this was originally called the Great Standing. There is also a second hunting lodge in the forest that was called the Little Standing. And this was originally built by Henry VIII. So that it would have had an open side. There you go, there's the dog. It would have had an open side to it so that people could actually sit and watch the deers being hunted. You can see from that middle photo, the view, even now, even in the sort of 2024, the view is pretty impressive of the open land, which was all part of the Royal Forests. It did get enclosed eventually by Queen Elizabeth. And the story that is interesting about her is what she actually is supposed to have done in this place. Now, he originally built it in 1543, and as I said, it was open-sided originally. But it's one of the stories about him that I find quite amusing. So he did hunt in Epping Forest a lot. He liked Epping Forest. Obviously, it's not a million miles from London. It would have been, and he would have, Henry VIII was not into being a monarch. He liked the nice bit of being a king, shall we say, as opposed to the boring bit of actually having to rule his country. And he did go hunting there a lot. And supposedly one time he'd gone hunting and he was in disguise as a non-king and was being fed at Waltham Abbey, at the Abbey at Waltham. And obviously we all know that Henry VIII is meant to have had quite a hearty appetite. He ended up life as quite a big chap. And he was eating so much that the abbot of Waltham said to him that he would give £100 to eat so heartily. And obviously £100 back then in the 16th century is a hell of a lot of money. Not realizing this was King Henry VIII he was telling this to. The next day, the abbot is supposedly taken to the Tower of London and completely bemused as to what he's done wrong. He, as far as he knows, he's not done anything to upset the king. So why is he being taken to the Tower of London and being fed nothing but meagre bread and water? Well, a few days later, the abbot is given a very, very hearty sirloin steak, which, unsurprisingly, he demolishes. He's hungry. He's been on nothing but bread and water. At this point, Henry VIII walks in and says, there you go. You've demolished it as heartily as you want. I want my £100. Apparently, the abbot paid up and was taken home back to the abbey, quite amused at what had happened. As I say, don't know if it's true, but it's quite an amusing story. And Henry VIII is supposed to have had form, shall we say, of dressing up. He did it to, I believe it was to Anne of Cleves at one point as well as other people. So it's plausible he could have done it, but £100, that's a lot of money. One of the other stories is that Queen Elizabeth I did visit Epping quite a lot. One of her paramours, shall we say, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, who also owned Kenilworth Castle, he actually owned Wanstead Park, which again, part of the Royal Forest of Waltham. And she would come and visit the area quite a lot. She also liked hunting. She was very, very proficient horsewoman. And in 1589, she did actually have the lodge redeveloped, if you like, and sort of part of it made a bit more watertight. But the legend to do with her is that when she found out that the Spanish Armada had been defeated, she rode up the staircase on her horse after she'd been hunting to celebrate. Now, I can ride horses. It is possible to. Coming back down would be interesting. But yes, she's supposed to have ridden her horse up the staircase. I've never investigated the place. I don't know whether there's anything there or not. But it is a really interesting building to go and look around. And like I say, it's free. And there's not many things like that are. Now, I'm gonna finish. You'll probably be just check what the time is. Yeah, I'm gonna finish on the story that appeared in that episode of Help My House is Haunted and started the book, The Elements of Epping Forest, in the first place. If anyone's interested why I called it The Elements of Epping Forest, one of the things I discovered doing my research is there are an awful lot of deaths, suicides that have taken place in the forest. And I would have assumed that most of those would have been due to people hanging themselves from the trees or maybe even shooting themselves. Most of them have been to do with drowning, tragically, drowning in all the various waterways. And this story is one of those. So I thought, well, Epping Forest does contain the 4 elements. So let's look at all the things that apply to these 4 elements, which is why it's called the Elements of Epping Forest. This is the Royal Forest Hotel in Chingford, which is next door to Queen Elizabeth's Hunting Lodge, which is next door to Butler's Retreat. You don't have to go far to visit these places. It has its own ghost story. I have tried looking up the history to see if there's any validity in the ghost story. Yes, there was a horrendous fire there in May 1912. The building is now, it's missing where you see it in that old photo, the top level, the 4th floor of the building, that doesn't exist anymore. That's one of the bits that burnt down and they never rebuilt it to that height. But there's meant to be a fireman and 2 guests who perished in the fire back in 1912 and meant to haunt the building. I can't find any confirmation that anyone like that did actually die. In fact, all the newspaper accounts say everyone was accounted for. But that's meant to be some of the hauntings. Again, they may not have actually died. They may have returned there after death. It's still meant to have, and people who've worked there have said they've seen stuff, they've experienced stuff. It has just been re-bought out by another group because it was going to be shut down or turned into flats, but it is going to maintain as a hotel if anyone's interested. But this is where my last story takes us. So on the 22nd of July 1891, a commercial traveller was staying at the hotel. It's been a hotel a long time. He was staying at the hotel and he finds a woman who we know to be called Mary Jane Heathcote, incredibly distressed. She was soaking wet and he went up to her and he said, what's happened? And she tells him she's murdered her 2 children and that she wants to be taken to the police station. Obviously, Charles is quite shocked. It's not every day, fortunately, you meet a woman who says she's murdered her 2 children. He calls for assistance, and yes, she is taken to the police station, and they start to find out what had actually happened. Now, she was married to Joseph. He was a good man. They lived in Stoke Newington, which is about 7 miles away. And her 2 children were Florence, who was 5, known as Florrie, and Emily, who was 3, known as Sissy. Now, the 3 of them had been suffering from flu. They'd contracted it much earlier in the year and were just not recovering. And she told Joseph, her husband, that she was going to take them to the forest because the air there was going to be good for their lungs, obviously out of Stoke Newington, and she was going to help them recover. But what she'd actually decided was she didn't want to see them go on like that, and she was scared that if she stayed ill, she couldn't care for them and nobody else would, and that they would have probably ended up in somewhere like the workhouse because Joseph couldn't care for them. So she felt the best scenario was for the 3 of them to die. In fact, the suicide note was actually found in her pocket when the police apprehended her, and it showed quite clearly that she'd planned to take all 3 of their lives. When she appeared in court some months later, and you can actually read the court transcript, it's on the Old Bailey Cases website, witnesses said about how good a mother she was and how caring she was, and that since they'd been unwell, since they'd all been unwell, she had developed a kind of religious euphoria and could be heard shouting out scripture to anyone who would listen, but she still cared for her little girls. And what she had actually done was taken them to one of the streams that are in the Epping Forest, Waltham Forest. She'd filled their pockets with stones to weight them down, and then filled hers and climbed on top of them to drown both them and herself. Although unfortunately for her, because she wanted to leave this world, there wasn't enough water. And although the two little girls tragically died, she didn't. And they actually, amazingly for the 19th century, they actually found her, while she was very much guilty of murder, they actually found her to be non compos mentis. And rather than being chucked in a prison or hanged, which would have been the normal sort of thing for infanticide, she was sent to the mental health wing at Holloway to be released at the court's discretion. And unfortunately, the records showing her being at Holloway don't exist anymore. But there are the records here which show her being found guilty, but being taken to Holloway jail to serve her sentence. And the doctor who was observing her said to the courts, basically, she doesn't deserve to die for this. She is ill. She just didn't know what else to do. Now, I can tell you she was released from prison, and I can tell you she did stay with Joseph, but her story didn't end there. And if you want to know any more about what happened to Mary Jane Heathcote, you need to read my book, because her story gets very, very, well, I think it gets interesting. Not to take away the fact that she took her two daughters' lives away. She did it. She thought she was saving them. She thought if she died with them, they would all go to heaven together and she could look after them. Tragically, that didn't happen. But the fact that they did take the fact she was having bouts of mania and that she was not well into account, and Joseph stood by her, I think is quite amazing. And that was the story that started off my book, Elements of Epping Forest. And as I say, all my books are available on Amazon. And that's me done.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. I've put the link for your books for Amazon in the chat below.
Thank you.
So if anyone wants to jump on there. That was an excellent talk. Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting.
Thank
I like
you.
about the owls too. And it's funny how these like normal things, as it were, can sometimes prove to be the answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was fantastic. Christian, did you want to take over with the questions?
Yeah, sure, I can do. Thank you for a fantastic fab talk. As I was really entrenched in that. Was really good. I was taking on a whole journey there with lots of different stories, lots of different segues.
Like I say, I was trying to give everyone little tidbits to get them interested rather than going on just one thing. But I do hope some people laughed at my joke, because obviously I can't see if anyone did. Normally when I'm in a room with people, I can see who's finding me funny. But yeah, the owls, twit, twit, twoo. Yeah, I don't think I'd want to be attacked by owls, to be quite honest. They're quite scary. They've got talons.
Oh yeah, you can imagine, of course, that if they're very very possessive, they've got chicks nearby.
Uh-huh.
They'll be like, dashing down and causing all kinds of chaos.
Yeah.
The fact that was almost taken to be poltergeist phenomenon is quite interesting, because I guess no one identified an owl previous to that.
Well, I say, when I was researching for the book, I didn't find any of the articles that I subsequently found when I was putting this talk together. So that was quite interesting. That is an exclusive. That's not even in the book, the owls. That's new information.
That's great. Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. So really, the kind of the comments, I would say questions are not so much present, but more comments as we kind of rolled through your discussion that were very active. Lots of things I mentioned about declawing animals being so cruel. You've got Kieran here talking about how the Norman invasion took parts of England, but the task was short and simple compared to holding their native population, who were regularly rebelling because all the kind of activeness about that. I mean, I actually made a comment regarding North Nottingham, where there's a village called Linby, and I call it the Footian village, because every kind of phenomena that we associate with the paranormal is found in this one small village. But in this particular village there's two crosses that are there. There's a Southern Cross and there's a Judgment Cross, and it's when you were talking about how there was situations where hands would be lopped off, where you'd have a judgment. In this particular case, would come from the galleries of justice. The would come to the local town, and then basically it's because the peasants, as it were, the public, would go into the forests and go into the woodland, or taking fish out the stream, stealing gooses. Was the account I read, and this gentleman had his hands cut off at this cross, and that was a regular occurrence. It used to happen on a Sunday at that particular cross there. So these accounts are, right up against royal lands. That was like Newstead Abbey, right up against there.
Yep.
So Darren Hudson says he used to train regularly at Lippett's Hill.
I've just seen that. I'm very jealous. Yeah, I'm very jealous. The worst thing is that MPAS has decided to use North Weald now more than Lippett's Hill. So I've been trying to get back into Lippett's Hill to explore a bit more, but they've changed the staff. So I've got to try and work my magic again. But saying that, North Weald's a very cool place as well. So, but you can get into North Weald quite easily.
Lippett's Hill itself, is it? You said it was a POW camp throughout World War II. I mean, so what is it now? It was a bit ambiguous about what it's used for now.
Well, it's a police. I mean, Darren here would probably be able to tell you more than me, but it became, the police took it over the site in the 1950s. And in fact, there's actually like a quasi Cold War bunker there as well that even the standard police here, they're not allowed to go into, because I asked them if they could, and it's all under lock and key. It's all very mysterious, but there's loads of different factions of the Met Police apparently based there. But yeah, they used to do gun training, firing training, whatever. I can't remember what it's called now. They used to do a lot of that there. They do a lot of the dog training there as well, apparently, when they do the dogs sort of searching stuff out, because all the older, like the gun emplacements and stuff, they can hide stuff in for the dogs. But yeah, it was I don't even know if they have still got the helicopters there, because I know they'd shut it down for a while, and they were talking about moving the helicopters over to North Weald, which is a few miles away. So, but it's police owned. So, or shall I say in the book, don't try and get on the site unless you're a police officer, because you'll probably be escorted off, because there's a lot of them there.
Because I guess I'm trying to think in my head because I've been past there, trying to think of the size of what it is comparatively for what it would be used for. Yeah,
have a look on. You can see it on Google Earth. If you go on Google Maps, you can see the site and how big it still is. In fact, if you come in on Google, you can actually see some of the gun emplacements that are still there.
Excellent. Simon Grace talks about, can we have more of a talk on airfields next time? So I guess someone really was clued in on that one.
Oh, it's music to my soul being asked to talk about airfields, I tell you. My most recent podcast that I did is actually on Heathrow.
Oh, excellent.
On Haunted Histories with Claire from Don't Scare Claire. We were talking about Heathrow Airport. Yeah, I can talk airfields. I can talk airfields.
Do you think runway 3 is ever going to take precedent?
Don't know. That I couldn't tell you on. I prefer the whole side of it, the history side of it. I don't know.
Heathrow is one of those places that, although it's in London, it's not really in London. It's like so far out. A bit like Wembley. People think Wembley's in the centre of London. It's not. It's like all the way over there.
I think the problem with Heathrow is it would be, it's the flight path that it has to follow, and the noise pollution for people living near there and all of that. But it's got an interesting history, especially as the fact it was built on a heath, which one of the things we did actually mention is Dick Turpin is supposed to haunt it. Of course, Dick Turpin is the only ghost who works as hard as blooming Anne Boleyn. So that's one. But yes, I can talk airfields and aviation. Tell what particular airfields would you like to talk on?
Simon, do you want to chime in on that one? Just drop a message into there if you like. Any particular place? Any particular ones
at all?
No.
Somebody did mention Hangman's Hill. Yes, that is one of the supposed myths of the area. I'm sure some scientists went out there and said it's an optical illusion, but I was trying to include ones that maybe people hadn't heard of, shall we say.
Okay. So Nigel Bundy makes an interesting comment here. I'm not quite sure he's phrased it correctly because I'm trying to read it and my brain isn't quite processing.
The suicide pond.
Yeah. Also, the serial killer of Epping Forest. What's that?
Right. Well, there's been quite a few killers in Epping Forest. They're two separate things. So the suicide pond, I try not to talk about this too much because I'm I'm aware of the fact there are people who are in a bad place and are possibly looking for that kind of thing, shall we say. So the legend of the suicide pond, as I say, Epping Forest has an awful lot of waterways, a lot more than you'd expect. And the legend is there's this pond in the forest, and I've never specifically gone looking for it, where nothing is alive. It's dark, it's foreboding, and it's meant to lure people to their deaths. It's meant to lure people to drown themselves. The story behind it is that hundreds of years ago, a young woman was in love with this bloke, was told they couldn't be together. She drowned herself in it. It wasn't quite Romeo and Juliet, because for some stories say he drowned himself subsequently, other stories say he tried to save her. There's lots of different stories, but basically she's now the vengeful lover who tries to drown people who go near this pond. The thing is, there has been quite a lot of suicides in the last 300-400 years attributed to this particular pond in Epping Forest, and it's got the nickname the Suicide Pond.
Okay. And the serial killer, is that a separate story then, you say?
Well, I don't know which serial killer he's relating to, because when I was researching, I found quite a few that weren't even solved, who seemed to use the forest as their dumping ground. I even found a case that could possibly intimate that the child killer, the baby farmer, Amelia Dyer, might have dumped a couple of bodies there, because there was a couple of babies found during her time that were wrapped up the same way that she used to wrap the babies up that she killed.
Okay.
So I'm not sure which one he's potentially, because like I say, there's an awful lot.
Is that really just because of the I guess how the shape of the forest? It's a dark, secluded place.
Huge.
Yeah,
it's huge. You can't possibly cover the whole of it. And yes, Simon, I know Nigel from Out There Paranormal. We have debated on some of our mutual historical research on more than one occasion.
So I see Simon's mentioned here about Doncaster is local to me. Anything you know about that one? Nigel from Out There Paranormal.
Not off the top of my head. Not off the top of my head. I know quite a few bits, but not off the top of my head. I mean, the World War II bomber bases, they're the ones that I'm very interested in, the whole bomber thing, but also the US bomber side. I know an awful lot about, say, RAF Tibenham, which is in Norfolk, where the 445th was based. Jimmy Stewart, the actor, was one of their pilots. Commanders, actually, and then he went over to Old Buckingham Airfield, and then he was based actually in a place called Ketteringham, which is where the headquarters for the 2nd Air Division was. And I can notice Kieran nodding his head. Yes, I lived there. I used to live there. That's how I know. And I used to fly from Tibenham. So yeah, I know quite a lot about those. But yeah, it doesn't take me long to learn about an airfield, because it's something I love learning about the different, and you do find a lot of commonalities between them.
I was going to say, so yeah, I see there's a comment here about a US Air Force base allegedly very haunted at Rougham. Is it Rougham? Is that
Rougham? Yeah, Rougham Airfield. Done that one. Been there. Experienced something very weird. Yes, that is meant to be haunted. It's actually the only bit you can really visit there is the old control tower. But I have had some weird experiences there. I do actually talk about Rougham in my first book, My Haunted History. So yes, I have had weird things there, but again, some of the hauntings that are meant to happen there is historical evidence that they could be true. And it is quite an interesting one. But I must admit, with the air bases, I like going to the ones that people don't tend to visit, that are just almost functioning airfields still. Like I was the first person ever to do an investigation at RAF Tibenham, and I've done 2 there now, and I'm the only person to do official investigations at RAF Tibenham. But yes, Rougham it's well worth a visit if you're interested in that kind of history, but also because the museum there is brilliant, if nothing else. But also, if you're interested in doing an investigation there, it's definitely worth looking into.
I can remember as a kid, we always used to go to Duxford for like the weekends. So I had spent many hours walking around there, enjoying the massive aircraft that you can see there in the museum that is. Some of the air shows that went on. So they were always amazing to go and see. And for those people who've never even been on an aircraft, just sit in like essentially a functioning Lancaster bomber, of what I say unfunctioning because it's just there, and to see how manual those machines were.
Yeah.
Is
They're my favorite. I'm Lancaster bombers are my favorite aircraft of all time. A lot of people talk about Spitfires and things like that, which are beautiful and they're amazing to watch fly. But I love Lancaster bombers. I just think there's just something about the Lancaster that just it just. I mean, I'll tell you all a funny story. So, it was our second wedding anniversary, and we decided we were going to go out somewhere for the day. And my husband was like, "Where do you want to go?" And I said, "Well, we haven't been to Duxford for years. I haven't been there since I was a kid. Why don't we go to Duxford for the day?" So I'm in Essex, about an hour away. So we decided we're going to Duxford for the day. And one of his mates phoned up and was like, "Oh, it's your wedding anniversary. You're going into London, going for a minute?" He went, "No, we're going to our Duxford for the day." And his mate goes, "Mate, you could have done something Penny wanted to do." And he went, "Penny does want to do this. Penny chose this." And they were like, "How do you find a wife who wants to look at aeroplanes on her wedding anniversary?"
That's great.
I know, I'm unusual. And yes, I am a plane geek, Caroline. You know that.
I mean, so how many Lancasters actually are there now? Is it 3 that's left?
There's in this country, the only one I believe that is allowed to fly is the Battle of Britain one. I might be wrong because there's a second one that they're trying to get airworthy that you can go taxiing in, but I don't think it's got his airworthiness yet. A few years ago there's one that flies still in Canada, I think, that they flew. I mean, there's loads of ones you can visit, like there's one at Duxford and everything else. But I'm pretty sure there's only one currently airworthy last time I checked.
I mean, where I live like north of Nottingham, so RAF Hucknall, well, formerly RAF Hucknall was not too far from here, where they developed like, the Flying Bedstead that became the Harrier, and over the course of the last 5 years, that airstrip has been cut and chopped up and turned into industrial land now. So the control tower is there, Rolls-Royce Aerospace is still there, but now it's just a non-functioning entity. Just dealing with its business side of things now rather than the airfield that it once was.
Yeah,
it's a shame to see that just disappear over the course of 5 to 10 years. So
yeah,
I'm pretty sure.
I mean, my dream location to investigate would be Scampton, RAF Scampton, as I'm a massive Guy Gibson groupie from Dam Busters fame. For anyone who doesn't know who he was, and it would be my dream to get in at Scampton, but they just keep blocking me every time I request it. So. But that's one that they've had to obviously fight not to have the buildings demolished, and I think even James Holland, the World War II historian, got involved in that. So it is a shame, but it's like with a lot of the different things that history-wise. I mean, my other specialism is workhouses, like the Victorian workhouse, and there's not many of those still. No, I don't mean as workhouses still remaining, but when you think of how many there were at its peak. The fact there's only 3-4 museums that explain what they were still left, to me, is astounding. So it seems to be a case of, especially with bomber bases, because even now people still seem to look down on them, and they do seem to have no qualms in destroying that part of Britain's history, which I don't like, if I'm honest.
No, people forget that, essentially children from a very young age were put to work in those workhouses. People literally lived and worked in them, and that was the purpose. But I have heard very recently that there was an intention, off the paranormal topic here, to actually bring back a workhouse-like environment into a city that's in Norfolk, where you literally would earn your residency while working there. They're trying that out again.
The thing about children, I could school you on this, what the children actually did do in the workhouses, but it's one of those things that the logic behind it was sound, but it's like with so many things, it was the individuals running them that corrupted them. So it's like with a lot of things, like the logic of things is sound, but you can't control the human element. And that's what the problem with a lot of the workhouses. The spike, someone's put there is a spike in Guildford that used to house tramps. Yes, the spike is another word. It was actually one of the slang for the workhouse. So they even used to call the workhouse the Bastille. That was another one they used to call it. And some workhouses did have what they call vagrants wings. I didn't even know I was going to be talking about this tonight. So they did have vagrants wings, which were the tramps, itinerants, vagrants. But not all workhouses did. Not all of them had a vagrant wing. But yes, the Spike in Guildford, the museum you're talking about in Guildford, yes, it did have a vagrants wing, but the Spike was a nickname for the workhouse.
Wow.
And the reason it was called that, if anyone's interested, is that one of the things they used to have to do there was something called oakum picking, where they would take old bits of rope and break it down into the fibers, and then they would use those for shipbuilding, for waterproofing ships. And the thing that they used to use to break it down was they'd ram it onto a spike to break up the bits of rope. Hence, it was nicknamed the Spike.
The Spike makes sense. So, what? Could you remind us all when your book is due out? You said it's due out very soon.
And my new one, any day. I'm just awaiting confirmation from the publishers. There's been a bit of a hold up, so it's imminent. If anyone follows me on Haunted Histories, it will be announced on there as soon as I know a launch date.
All right, fantastic. Thank you very much. Claire, do you have anything else you want to add, or does anyone want to jump in with a question, perhaps?
No, I think I'm okay. If anybody would like to jump in with a question or a comment, that would be great, as always. We have the most interesting and diverse membership, as you know, and they always love to join in and ask questions and put comments, which is great because it's how we keep these discussions alive.
Yeah.
Kieran, was there something you wanted to say?
Well, yes, it was just picking up on this business of oakum picking. Oakum is a name for, in a sense, some of the components of rope. So what you would do in the workhouse is you would oakum pick, and you would use this thing called a marlin spike to do that, to pick apart a rope and separate out the old rope, which had been rotten or whatever, from the good oakum, which could then be made into new fresh rope.
They didn't just use it for new fresh rope, they also used it for waterproofing ships.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
That's quite right. They used it for a number of different things because obviously it was a question like now that you can only use a certain amount of recycled materials because otherwise the entire product ends up suffering. So there are different uses for, picked oakum, if I can put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Nice, excellent.
Fabulous. Thank you, Kieran.
Thanks.
Was there anything else you wanted to add, Christian?
No, I'm all good. Thank you very much. All nice and factually filled. I've done some graphic artwork that I've posted on the Facebook group and into here as well. So when this goes live,
that
will be covered.
So quick and so professional. Penny, thank you again for a wonderful talk. We look forward to having you back on soon. There are evidently a lot of people that would like to hear your airfield talk. And
I'll start writing it.
I haven't been to many myself, but Rougham is one I have been to. And as part of a private investigation group, we were allowed to stay the night in the mess, which was very, very cool. We had Glenn Miller playing and everything. Very
nice.
But yes, I will get in touch with you. We'll get a date from you. We'll get it set up. And thanks a million to you all for coming tonight. Thanks especially to Penny, to Christian for doing all the graphics and the artwork and for putting it on YouTube, inevitably in the next 10 minutes or so. No pressure, Christian. And we will see you all next week. So thank you and good evening.
Thank you.
All right, take care, everyone. Have a good night.